AI enable you or your buyers. This is a joint webinar between PathFactory and the Marketing AI Institute. I have Nick Edouard with me. Nick, you there?
I am indeed, Paul.
Wonderful.
Good morning, everyone.
So this is me and Nick. You're looking at our lovely faces here. And Nick and I actually met back in, was it 2017? We did that ICC panel together, I think?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
So Nick and I got the chance to spend some time on a panel, and it was quite enjoyable. At the time, they were Lookbook HQ, if I remember,
Yep.
since rebranded as PathFactory. And so just a quick background on the Institute, if you're not familiar. So we created the Marketing AI Institute in 2016. And our mission was to make AI approachable and actionable for marketers. There was companies like PathFactory who were out there building smarter technology, and a lot of marketers just didn't know to look for it. And then when they did find it, they didn't know what questions to ask and how to shop differently for that smarter AI-powered tech. And so PathFactory was actually one of our early supporters for the Institute, and they were a big sponsor of ours. And so I'm going to let Nick just kind of give a little background on himself, but he is the co-founder, president, and chief product officer at PathFactory. And so I'm going to turn it over to Nick. He's going to talk to us for probably about 25, 30 minutes. We can take questions throughout. So if you have questions, go ahead and pop them into that Q&A panel. And then at the end, we'll have plenty of time to answer those. And if anything urgent comes up, we'll flag it for Nick to answer as we're going. But Nick, I'm going to turn it over to you, and then I'll jump back in when we get done. If you want to give us a little overview on PathFactory, and then dive into today's webinar.
Sure, will do. Thank you, Paul, and thank you, everyone. Very happy to be here. Apologies in advance. I do have a slight cold, which I don't normally sound like this. Well, I do sound British. You haven't picked up on that. I most definitely am British.
You sound great.
Thank you. I do feel a bit croaky. So bear with me. I'm sucking a halls and trying to soothe my throat. But I'm very excited to be giving this webinar this morning, because it's something that's very near and dear to my heart and to all of our customers too. If you're not familiar with PathFactory, I'll give you 60 seconds on us. We are a marketing software company based here in Toronto. We work with about 170 kind of leading B2B enterprise and mid-market companies like Thomson Reuters and ADP and Cisco and IBM. You would probably, I'm sure, know all of their names. And you can read faster than I can talk. Our solution is very much focused on the activation of content in the buying journey, and we do use a fair whack of AI to do that. We're going to use AI increasingly in our future too, and I'll touch on some of these things. But we're very chuffed that that's an English word, being excited. I'm very chuffed to have been selected by Gartner as one of the 3 cool vendors in marketing technology for 2019, and even more chuffed by the fact that TrustRadius recently voted us the #1 out of 141 different content marketing solutions, and that's very special, because that's based upon customer reviews, so hopefully that speaks to having a happy customer base delivering really awesome results. They're doing that by first and foremost enabling their buyers. So today I want to really cover 3 big things. I always like to start with kind of what's going on, because we need the context to understand really, I think, the role for AI in sales and marketing in 2019. So I want to start with how B2B buyers are changing, and then what we call buyer enablement, why that's more important than ever in the era of kind of self-directed buying journeys. And then really, there's a bit of a logical flow here, then how AI can help us actually deliver and achieve these kind of hyper-personalized one-to-one marketing at scale. And that's obviously the dream. It's been a dream for as long as I've been involved in B2B marketing, which is quite a long time now, and we're really close to delivering on it, which is phenomenally exciting. So let's step back and think about what's happening with B2B buyers. I think we'd all agree that over the last kind of 10 years or so, the way that we buy has changed a lot. I personally really lost without Amazon in my life these days. My youngest son's birthday is coming up, and I've already got a wish list going on Amazon, and I'm going to add it to my cart and click and buy, and that's a very easy transaction, something that wasn't possible when I was his age, for example. And I think one of the things that's very true that's happening is, and the lovely thing about working in B2B is that we've all got this B2C life too, right? Outside of our 9 to 5. So these 4 services dominate my life: Netflix, Uber, Amazon, Spotify. I come back from time and time again because they do a great job of matching demand, me, with supply, movies, birthday presents, a fleet of cars, music, in a frictionless way. And we think very much here at PathFactory that B2B marketing is exactly the same issue, and sales, for that instance. It's a supply and demand issue. How do we match demand with supply? Whereas demand is our buyers or our customers, and supply is the content that we're producing, the information that they're looking for to educate. Now, one of the things, the kind of consequence of services like Netflix and Amazon, etc., in our B2C life is it's changing B2B buyers and what they expect from their their B2B experience. They're expecting something that is far more personalized. It does look and feel more like the B2C experiences that they're familiar with. Forrester has been writing a lot about this. They've been writing about the rise of consumerized B2B buyers. And that's exactly what they mean by that. Now, these B2B buyers are obviously part of a buying committee. That's one of the added complexities in B2B. We're not just dealing with Steve, we're dealing with Steve and probably 6, 7, maybe as many as 20 other people that are stakeholders in a buying committee. So if we're trying to sell a large scale, $200,000 global enterprise risk management software, there's a lot of people involved in that buying committee. The other thing that's happening as a result of our B2C lives is that B2B buyers want to stay anonymous for longer. Now that creates a bit of a tension for us. How on earth do we serve them a personalized experience if someone's anonymous? We'll touch on that in a tick. And most importantly, coming back to this kind of supply and demand issue, they want frictionless access to content as they self-educate. Because you've probably all seen this by now. I mean, it's been, people have been talking about how the buyer's journey has been changing for 5+ years, probably longer. 67% of it, according to Gartner, I've seen stats that suggest it's even longer, is being done by these buyers themselves, right? The emphasis is very much now on marketing. Marketing is picking up more of the slack from sales. The role of sales in that buyer's journey is becoming less and less. And obviously, frequently that portion of it's competitive. They're not just meeting with you, they're meeting with some of your competitors too. So really the emphasis needs to be on this 67%. How can we help them self-educate whenever and wherever we see them? Both Steve and the other people in his buying committee. The problem, excuse me, the problem with B2B marketing is that we haven't architected it for people like Steve. We haven't architected it for consumerized B2B buyers. Think about the way in which maybe your own MarTech stack works, or certainly the V1 of the MarTech stack, which is all focused around things like marketing automation and CMS and CRM. It's really designed to help you, the marketer, not necessarily your buyers. So things like drip nurture campaigns, for example. Marketing automation taught us that we could manufacture demand by nurturing people. So we're going to send an email tomorrow morning, say at 10 a.m. to 10,000 people, because that's a good time for all of those 10,000 people. That works on the marketer schedule. It doesn't work on your buyer schedule. And we're going to advertise maybe our blog article. And then we're going to wait a week. And then we're going to email those 10,000 people again with kind of our second installment in their buyer's journey, our video, etc. We drip content through to them in a way that simply is out of whack, out of alignment with the way in which people actually behave. Think about the last time that you made a considered purchase, for example. Did you do it by researching an aspect of, say, a car, kind of one thing every week? Did you show up to the dealership and on a Saturday morning and ask them about the engine, and then go away and come back the following Saturday and ask them about the trim options, and then go away and come back and ask them about the in-car entertainment system? Of course you didn't. You research in a concentrated fashion. And that's what we're seeing across all of our customer base. That typically about 1 in 5 of your visitors are looking to engage with more content in session. So we also do things like put gates in front of people, for example. How, for example, do we make it hard for someone to actually access the content in the first place? If we put a long form in front of them, why would we do that? Why would we put a barrier between Steve and his education, as opposed to asking him to convert day after he's just given us 3 minutes of his precious time and attention? So B2B marketing today is riddled with kind of complexity and friction. We make it hard for buyers to self-educate. And that's showing up in things like this. I love this. This is something in May this year. Forrester for Adobe was looking at buyer journey complexity. And you can see here to the right, or kind of the medium, the kind of volume, my rough eyeball says it's kind of 70% plus, is hard. People are finding it medium to high journey complexity, a lot higher than B2C. And that's probably no surprise then that this is Gartner's last take on what the B2B buyer's journey looks like today. And in England, we would call that a bugger's model. It's really complicated. 77% of B2B buyers are saying that purchasing has become very complex and difficult. So whatever our MarTech stack looks like, it's failing buyers here and now for all some of those reasons I mentioned. It's working on our schedule, not the buyer's schedule, etc. And therefore, it's failing marketing and the business too. Less than 1% of B2B leads turn into paying customers. That is not a great return for an investment, typically kind of 8% of revenue into B2B marketing. So one of the things that I think is a truism in 2019 is that these consumerized B2B buyers are here to stay. They know they are in total control of their buying journeys, and they know it. And that means that our job in sales and marketing has fundamentally changed. We need to be enabling these people, right? How do we help them buy? Help the buyers buy. I think Laura Ramos from Forrester talked a lot about this, and it's so simple, it's so elegant. We sometimes lose sight of that when we abstract B2B marketing into things like MQL targets and campaigns, etc. But that's our job, really, at the end of the day, is to help these buyers buy. So what does all this mean? Well, it means that predefined nurture is dead, right? It's not accommodating this very natural behavior of the people that you care about most, actually, are those that are looking to go faster than your schedule allows. It means that we need better data. We need behavioral data. If Steve's staying anonymous, as I mentioned before, that creates a tension for us. How do we personalize an experience for an anonymous visitor? Well, we have to do it based upon what content they're engaging with and what topics are resonating with them, not just clicks and visits and form fills. Those things speak to quantity. They don't tell me anything about the quality of an engagement. We need hyper-personalization at scale. For Steve, I mean, if you think about how many of monthly uniques you get on your website, our customer base typically has kind of north of 5,000 monthly uniques. How on earth would you personalize all those experiences? Something that we can't really do very easily. That's where AI can come in. So we need this hyper-personalization at scale to be able to speak to these people and stop marketing at them and start enabling them. So this all kind of wraps up in something that we call kind of buyer enablement, which is all focused on removing the friction for B2B buyers by enabling them to find and consume the right information at the right time. So if we do the hard work of getting Steve to say, click on that email, we're going to send him at 10 o'clock tomorrow, and he's going to click through to that report. How do we sequence the blog and the video? Things that might live 4 clicks away, might live on entirely different digital properties, but how do we package it up and deliver it for Steve? And it's worth solving for. This is just a select kind of return on investment and results from some of our customers. And first and foremost, kind of shock horror, if you get people to engage with more of your content, they're going to convert better. They're going to self-educate. They're going to get faster through your funnel. And that's going to show up fundamentally in revenue, which is something that just not marketing cares about, obviously, but fundamentally your business cares about. So with that's the backdrop, I think we've covered off kind of the way in which buyers are changing and the importance of focusing on enabling them. So really that begs the question, so what's the role for AI in all of this? How do we use AI to enable buyers? Now, there's some great examples of AI in B2B marketing already. Here's 3 that I'm a big fan of. Predictive ratings, target accounts. There's a lot of companies out there that can help you, that will design AI-driven models to analyze a large volume of data to identify who are your target accounts, who should you be focusing on, particularly as part of an ABM strategy, for example. That's great. That's a phenomenal level of insight for marketing. Who are my best customers? Who is likely to buy? Then there's things like predictive goal attainment. I think this is, I saw this early in the year at the Adobe Marketo Summit. Saw a wonderful thing. They were pointing Sensei into Marketo to say, all right, we're aiming to drive, say, 100 registrations for this webinar, and we're only at 80. So Sensei suggesting other people that may be interested in the webinar so that I can help hit my target, the marketer's target, 100 people registering for that webinar. And then there's things like Drift, for example, like the rise of what they're calling kind of conversational AI, conversational marketing. But really, at its core, it's just an alternative form conversion and qualification technique, right? Rather than engaging with a form, you're going to engage with some form of Drift chatbot to essentially put your hand up the whole way. The interesting thing, we're a Drift customer, become an integration with Drift too. The interesting thing about Drift is one of the things we've seen from our website is for every one person that's willing to engage with chatbots, there's conservatively at least 99 that are just looking for information, right? That don't actually want to do that, that don't want to actually put their hand up the whole way. So all three of these, I think, have an enormous amount of value, but they are focused very much on enabling us, the marketers, and not on actually helping our buyers buy. So coming back to that kind of headline statement, this is a supply and demand issue. How do we actually match demand, consumerize B2B buyers with supply, with our content, with our information? And there's precedents already, again, from the B2C space, from all those things that are big parts of our daily lives. The New York Times, because they have a vested interest in making sure that I consume as much content as possible. So here's how they do it. They kind of promote additional content to me in session. The same with YouTube. I'm sure we're all familiar with going down that kind of YouTube rabbit hole where you start to watch someone like Paul McCartney talking to James Corden, and then you end up finding this 20 minutes later and you've now watched 3 or 4 videos. Again, YouTube's got a vested interest. Amazon helping me discover the things I want. Netflix helping me find TV shows and things to actually binge on. They've really pioneered it, obviously, this whole idea of content binging. So all of these kind of experiences from our B2C life are surfacing the right information at the right moment to keep me engaged, to keep me moving forward. And that, the core underlying each of those 4 services is what's in AI parlance called a recommender system. So information filtering algorithms that help me basically make a smart recommendation on our next best asset or asset to someone in session. This helps us in kind of avoid information overload. All of that content, for example, was available on the New York Times, but what are the 3 or 4 things that maybe 3 or 4 clicks away that I need to see here and now that they know I'm going to find interesting? And as a result, you end up with things like this on Amazon. So I'm relieved to say that this is not actually a screenshot from my Amazon. It's actually a screenshot from one of our data science leads. I won't tell you what he was looking at, but somehow Amazon knew that he wanted a new pair of Crocs, and indeed he did. So slightly shameful, but helping Gene actually get the Crocs that he needs. If we can do this, so how do we make this relevant in kind of B2B marketing? Well, what we need to be aiming at to continue the Netflix analogy is what we've been referring to as the Steve channel. If Steve is our kind of next buyer, or maybe he's an existing customer, he's clicked through, as I mentioned before, to that video, how do we package up content and deliver it to him wherever we see him? How do we make sure that this really is hyper-personalized? I don't think there is any more used and misused word than personalization in B2B marketing. It frequently is never actually personalization. It's frequently it's personification. It's normally based on rules, heuristics. I live in Canada, for example, so I get an awful lot of things because I'm coming from Canada. It's treating me as a persona, not as an individual, not as a person. But all of this is in service of fundamentally letting Steve binge on our content, because with the greatest respect to your marketing teams and our own marketing team, this is still B2B content, this video, this third-party report. No one's spending time with it for their health, entertainment, or enjoyment. They're spending time with it because they've got to get something done. These are buyers or customers with jobs that they need to get done. And so learning more about Steve based on his behavior, that's a signal and a half. It's like the ultimate indication of interest and sales readiness. There's so much interest in B2B marketing at the moment in intent, and I love me some intent data. And intent's what's happening, obviously, in an account and stuff on third-party properties, typically. This is what's happening with your content. It's a first-party data set. But what's really important about recommender systems, as you can see from this screenshot, which is slightly embarrassingly, my own version of Netflix, is it's not just to do with recommendations, is it? It's taken me a while I've been obsessed with recommendations for a while, but it was only as Netflix evolved too that you start to see things like my watch it again in the top right and continue watching for Nick and my list, etc. And so we've done a lot of thinking about this to think, yes, recommendations are important, but it needs to be no more than that, because who knows Steve best? Is it Marty the marketer? He probably knows some things or two. He's looking at lead scores and all the like. Maybe he's looking at intent data. He thinks he's got a reasonable handle on Steve. Now, the machine's going to have a different perspective again, right? Its ability to process and parse a higher volume of content, of data than Marty enables them to have a whole series of indications and spot trends that he is looking like, or Steve works at a company that is a strong fit with their ideal customer profile, for example. But we can't leave Steve out of this, right? Steve knows himself better than Marty or the machine, ultimately. Steve knows, for example, that he's just come out of a budget meeting and he needs to come back in 2 weeks' time with a recommendation for a global risk management solution, right? That is now Steve's primary job. There is no way that Marty knows that or the machine knows that. Now, we might be able to start to infer it based on some of his activity, but Steve knows that. Steve is now in an advanced state of sales readiness where he is definitely self-educating. It's going to be looking to do as much information as possible. So we've been thinking a lot about this. While AI is phenomenally important, that recommender system has got to be in place and it needs high quality data to fuel it. But it's more than that. It's AI and UI, the user interface or the user experience. We've got to be combining these two so we marry things like recommendations with things like your history, the context, what's trending in your account, for example. And that's been guiding a lot of the work that we've been doing internally in our kind of R&D function, thinking about how do we actually do that? How do we take the best things that AI can support us with, things like recommender systems and the like, and how do we marry that with Steve and what we've seen? And we think that really there are only kind of really 4 classes of content, possibly a 5th, which I'll touch on. But if you stop and think about it, there's really only 4 types of content. There are things that, start at the bottom, that you have viewed, your history. So how do we actually help people find content that they've been looking for or they've engaged with previously and need to see again? We see this all day long in the data that we collect for our customers. People are looping back round and engaging with content multiple times. And again, coming back to that Gartner kind of buyer's journey thing earlier, it wasn't sequential. It never happened sequentially. We map things out in B2B marketing as kind of stage 1, stage 2, from awareness, consideration to evaluation, etc. And the reality is that those jobs, sometimes they happen at the same time, or they might happen not in the order in which we expect. Gartner's reports actually that over 90% of visitors are looping back round to see content, and we would definitely confirm that all day long. Sometimes it's in the same sessions, sometimes it's in repeat sessions, but people revisit content. So giving easy access to things that Steve has viewed sounds like a no-brainer to us. Now, there's things that you, the marketer, want someone to see too, right? Things that Steve might not be aware of. The fact that, for example, we are running a webinar on risk management software next week. We've just written a new white paper on this. And because Steve fits a rule on this, that he's working in the telecoms industry, for example, we want to promote that content to him. So featured is really important, obviously. It's how we're going to activate some of your most recent content. But then Steve, as we mentioned before, well, he's not alone in this decision. He's part of a buying committee. And what we need to do is to drive consensus across that committee. So we need to be able to show Steve that there are things that are trending in his account that his peers are looking at and finding valuable that he probably needs to see too. So by the time they all get back in that room to discuss something, they're all on the same page. They've engaged with the same content. So slight aside, but I'm sure some of you might remember that following on the heels of the success of Challenger Sales, CEB pioneered Challenger Marketing. And I thought it was a great idea. I was really interested in it. What I was even more interested in was about 2 years ago, I saw them present and said, you know what, Challenger Marketing might not have been spot on. It might have actually created more problems. Because at the core of Challenger Marketing was the kind of guidance to market to the various personas in the buying committee. Speak to marketing ops, speak to demand gen, speak to content, etc. But when we were speaking to those as individuals and personas with no commonality across it, what they found was when those people then got in a room, they weren't all on the same page. They hadn't reached consensus. And so it was actually slowing buying cycles down. So yes, we need to speak to people as individuals and to their personas, but at the same time, we need to drive consensus across that buying committee too. And then the final one actually is where we leverage the recommender system, right? Recommended for you, AI-driven, hyper-personalized, based upon your historic engagement. We use that quite a lot of AI in that to really look at how has Bob, or Steve rather, how has Steve engaged, what topics of interest has he shown strong engagement with, and therefore, what do we think he will want to see next? And given the size of our customer base, we've now got a very large data set to be able to actually make those models work again. Now, obviously, concierge, what I just showed you, that involves getting Steve somewhere. But what happens if he shows up on the front page of your website, right? And I would love to ask you all, but we can't do it. But by a show of hands, how many of you in the last 12 months have been involved in a conversation, if you work in marketing, whereby the subject of some form of website redesign, or maybe a new CMS has raised its head? My experience talking with our customer base is it's always a front and center consideration. How are we trying to optimize the website and navigation through it for an ultimate audience? And that's a non-impossible task, particularly if we're a mid-market or enterprise B2B, because of the volume of traffic that you have and the different types of people that are showing up on your website. And so what we wanted to do was to really build something which would, I guess the best way to describe it is as a personal navigation bar, right? That builds dynamically on the home page or wherever you want to deploy it for every single visitor based around those 4 types of content. So sure, you've just hit the front of PathFactory.com, but last week you engaged with a white paper via a display ad or an email nurture. Are you here trying to find it because you can't find that email anymore? What is happening in your account? What are the things that we think you should see based upon the fact that you really obviously enjoyed this white paper? And this is a far different experience to, we're not trying to reconfigure the website per se, we're trying to give you shortcuts through it to find the content you want, not just the content that's on the website, but also content that lives off the website. And certainly in B2B, that's normally the lion's share of content, because if we did stick everything on the website, it would end up reading like a reference library. Nobody wants that. So how do we create these kind of personalized shortcuts and navigation through the website? Now, I mentioned this earlier, but new data to understand buyers' behaviors and interests. Data is core to this. I know Paul and the team at Marketing AI have done some awesome work and research into the use of AI in marketing, but it's all premised on having good quality data. Now, I spent a lot of my 20s for my sins doing a lot of kind of corporate finance work, a lot of financial modeling. And this person that taught me financial modeling said, you just need to understand one thing. The model can be all singing, all dancing, but if you put rubbish data in, you get rubbish outputs out. And AI is exactly the same thing. We have to have good quality data to fuel AI if it's going to be meaningful and actually work well. And so as I mentioned earlier, it's not just enough to be looking at things like clicks and visits and form fill. We need to be able to not just accommodate Steve's propensity to binge, to self-educate, to engage with content. We need to be able to identify. We need to understand that he spent 4 minutes with the infographic. That really worked for him. And then he went on to spend 2 minutes, 46 seconds with a white paper, etc. And in aggregate, this is nearly 13 minutes of engagement. And that's phenomenal, again, because Steve is busy. Doesn't matter what sector you work in, B2B buyers share one thing in common. They are all remarkably busy. It's hard working in business in 2019. So Steve's busy. He gives us 13 minutes of his time. That is a signal and a half. And obviously understanding not just the time, but most importantly, what is the content about too? So we've had this in our application and our solution for a long time. We actually turn all content into a machine readable format and run natural language processing and kind of topic modeling, topic clustering on the content to understand the content in a way that possibly even the marketing team doesn't. Particularly in large enterprise, the person that wrote the content, the person that's responsible for deploying the content probably aren't the same people. And one of the things we saw across all of our customers several years ago was that tagging is hard. I write a reasonable amount of content. I find it remarkably hard to tag things. A, because I typically tag for our internal purposes, not for my buyer per se, but I tag for things like reporting and the like for our own marketing team. I also have a degree of confirmation bias in that. I wrote this, therefore I think it is about the following thing. And obviously something can be about one thing, but frequently it's about to do with lots more things. So when we looked at all the content libraries across our customer base a couple of years ago, I think only 40% of content was actually tagged with a topic. And of that, only 6% was actually tagged with multiple content assets. So we can find, with multiple topics. So we can have the content that Steve's engaging with something that is tagged by the marketer to do a payroll. And maybe we've got 499 other things that are to do with payroll. Great. Which one do we possibly want to recommend to Steve next, right? They all look the same if we just have an understanding of them that they're all to do with payroll. And so by extracting the content into a machine-readable format and then analyzing it, we can actually determine that, yeah, sure, it's through a payroll, but it's also with these 207 other things with increasing orders or decreasing orders of relevancy. And so what you see on the right-hand side is that this white paper is to do with envelope tracking fundamentals and test solution. It's a technical read. It's actually quite an interesting read. But sure, it's to do with testing. But it's also to do with these other 53 things for at least 70%. You see on the right-hand side, it's very granular. So we build a very rich content taxonomy across the entire content library. And that enables us to really understand the distance between content assets. Yes, you're reading with this content asset, and it's doing payroll, but it's also very strong on the behavioral science payroll. And you know what? Within these other 499, we've actually got 4 or 5 things that are very strong behavioral science too. So it's part of the same cluster of content within payroll. And obviously, again, too, we need to then be able to translate this into a reading time. How long should Steve actually spend reading? And what does good look like? So understanding the content in a very rich way, not just engagement, but actually understanding the content. That needs to go into fueling what we really view as kind of like this content and data B2B marketing flywheel, right? We've got the content, the supply side of our equation. We're going to try and serve multiple or next best asset to Steve in session, wherever and where we see him. While that's happening, we're going to be tracking very rich engagement data, mining that for insight, pushing that to other parts of the MarTech stack. So that sales, for example, know, well, Steve and Sandy both clicked on my Marketo email, but who do I actually want to ring? Well, Sandy only gave us 6 seconds and Steve gave us 12 minutes, and I'm phoning Steve all day long. And I know he's engaged with the content, and now I know which topics he's interested in. We also mine that for insight and use that to fuel the AI too, to be able to make smarter recommendations next time around. Now, we've talked a lot about kind of AI powering the activation side of things, but it can obviously power the kind of insight side of the equation too. We could probably spend the next half an hour talking about Eric Carlson's rather awesome article on Harvard Business Review, which I urge you all to go and have a peek at. But he's been talking a lot, he used to be the chief data scientist at Netflix, about how do we move from kind of data-driven decision-making frameworks to something which is actually AI-driven, and the best of both worlds that combines the power of AI and human judgment to make far smarter business decisions than we've ever been able to. And that's how we're actually going to optimize marketing performance and the return on our spend. If we are spending 8% of revenue into marketing, then how do we get a better return for that? Which channels, for example, actually lead to engagement that help us reach an audience that then binges on our content and self-educates and goes on to become closed won? Which campaigns, which content assets work? How do I place my bets far more smartly than I have been able to historically? So wrapping up, key takeaways. What have we covered in pretty short order? Well, B2B buyers have changed. They are now radically consumerized. They are bringing their experiences from B2C to bear on the B2B buying experience, and sadly finding it quite lacking at the moment. AI is the only way to deliver hyper-personalization. I cannot parse the volume of data and certainly not the speed of data. Everything that I could and should know about Bob and Sally or Steve to make smarter decisions over which content they should see next, and what's going to help them actually progress on their path to purchase. But it needs to be more than simply recommendations. We need to think about marrying AI with UI, with the user experience, to make sure that we are helping them get the job done. This is kind of low-level AI, basically. That's not particularly complicated. But how do we marry AI and UI together to really optimize the buying experience? And when Steve is engaging with that, how do we mint an entire new class of buyer behavior data that doesn't just understand if he clicks or visits a web page or fills in a form, but really understands what content's working for him, what content's working for us in the buyer's journey, what should we be spending more money on, etc. And then how do we actually push that data to other parts of the MarTech stack? Because if we can then mine that data, we're going to be able to make better decisions. We're going to actually be able to spend money on clicks and traffic that we know is going to turn into engagement. So that's what we've got. And I guess my call to action for you guys will be to think about the role of AI and how we can use it to fundamentally stop marketing and start enabling, not just start shouting at people, but giving buyers the tools to really self-educate and self-nurture through your buying experience and become better quality customers. So, Paul.
Brilliant. Well, thank you. Not only do we learn about B2B buyer journey, personalization, and recommenders, I think I learned about 4 new British words that I have to go back to. We need that key takeaways of awesome British words at the end too. So that was great. We do have a bunch of questions here, and one actually just came in right at the end as you were talking about tagging of content. So I'll get to that one because it's fresh. So you had mentioned how the AI enables you to auto tag content on your site. So if you're someone that isn't using a recommender engine right now, or this kind of tool that serves up recommended content, when you go to do a site redesign, do you install this automated tagging, or can you take any existing site with existing content that maybe already has tags, and does it enhance the existing tagging system? Does it replace the tagging system? So maybe just talk to us a little about how that tagging works.
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. So first and foremost, it enhances, because there's still always a need for tagging for internal purposes. And I mean, a website gets tagged for multiple reasons, SEO being an obvious one. So what we do, actually, you don't need to wait for a website redesign. We kind of have the ability to dynamically build kind of a website library. We're just about to release this feature. And that basically handles it all automatically on our customers' behalf. So if there are existing meta tags on the page, we're gonna grab those, and that's great. That's the way that you guys are thinking about your content taxonomy. But then the machine's gonna do its own thing next to it, right? So we stand up really 2 content taxonomies right next to each other. One which is kind of manually generated by yourselves, by the marketing team, and the other which is generated by the machine. Now you can push stuff from the machine generated to your manual, but we always kind of keep them separate, and we do consider both. Because normally they are first and foremost complementary, rather than one does not replace the other.
Okay. And you had mentioned 5,000 unique visitors a month as kind of a benchmark that some of your clients have. Is there a minimum amount needed for a recommender engine to work and to learn from this?
That's a very good question. Not really. I mean, that's a deeply technical question. So, I mean, if you've got a lower volume, then it might just take a bit longer, obviously. But one of the really important things to do within that is actually what's the percentage returning? Because if it's net new, then if someone's like a first-time visitor, then at that point we're leaning probably heavily on the recommender system for not personalized as such, but we're leaning for popular. So maybe we're going to know. We always know this because we get it from the browser data, but we know that someone's coming from France, for example. So in that case, we're going to be leaning heavily on the REST service to say, okay, what's popular? Netflix works in a very similar way. It's got these kind of 2 major components to its recommender system. One is popular, one is personalized. And you see this weighted the whole time. This is why everyone gets, for example, whatever that thing was, murder mystery or Bird Box. Was it? I still haven't watched that, but I think the entire world got that promoted. Probably because Netflix funded it, but also because it was popular. So we all get that.
Right.
And I think if you start to think about kind of the way in which your own experiences with Netflix, how it's kind of self-configured over time as you feed it with more and more data. We do something that's very similar to that. So coming back to the question, if you've got a lower number of uniques than per month, then that's not a problem. It might take a bit longer to train a model, but we'll be leaning more heavily on the popular until we can get to that personalized. And the popular, obviously, we still start to break down with some interesting characteristics across the customer base. For example, what do people in France typically engage with relative to people in North America, for example? But if you've got a high percentage returning, then that's where things can really start to sting. So, and what you'll probably see is during a buyer's journey that people will show up kind of repeatedly in a concentrated period of time. Now, obviously, that's only a fragment of the sales cycle. I always hear this from in B2B, obviously, that the general perception is that we all have long sales cycles, and we probably do from start to finish. But what you'll see is that a lot of the research phase happens in very concentrated bursts of engagement. I spend a lot of time looking at our own data that our marketing team produces, and I saw some customers that became customers in Q3. I knew they were going to become customers because I saw a volume of activity well before sales got involved in those discussions. 20, 25 people, maybe half known, half anonymous, showing up and engaging with our content on our website as part of our nurture. I think in one particular case, they had all engaged with our kind of overview video, and that made me so happy because I knew that by the time they got in a room to discuss PathFactory, they were at least all going to be on the same page. They had a kind of working understanding. Then I can start to see who's playing what role in the buying committee, who's going deep on stuff, who's actually championing it, who's sharing content with other people, etc. And that's invaluable insight, obviously, for a sales team.
Yeah, because I mean, I guess if we look at it now, and somebody else actually had a similar question that came in around how can it really personalize if it's the first time on the site? And I think your answer is really good. It's like Netflix, you're surfacing kind of the popular stuff until you can learn enough. And I think the difference is now, like if you just rely on marketing automation and your content strategy, some marketer on your team is trying to guess at the logical path someone's going to take. Oh, they looked at this ebook, they'll probably want to see these 3 blog posts. And that path doesn't get smarter unless the marketer goes in and looks at a bunch of data and adjusts it. Whereas a recommender engine, whether it's PathFactory or building it on Amazon's recommender, whatever you use, you're trying to have it get smarter on its own as it learns more and more about an individual person. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, very much so. And I think it's also important that we don't just focus on the website, right? The website's like part of the B2B buying experience, but it's by no means all of it. I mean, I'm sure some of your colleagues in demand gen, they don't drive people back to the website frequently, or if they do, they kind of, there's almost kind of digital sprawl happening on their digital footprint where they're spinning up kind of Marketo landing pages or the like, right? Because they're not driving anyone to, it's not as simple as driving someone to a resource center and saying, you know what, everything's here, knock yourself out, have at it. Like, if only. It doesn't work like that. So what we have seen is it's really important to look at content engagement across the entire buyer's journey, right? Again, as I mentioned earlier, there's kind of 3 core parts of the MarTech stack, typically in mid-market enterprise B2B at least. You've got the CMS, you've got the map, and you've got CRM. There's content engagement happening across all of those, and frequently it's siloed. So how do you join that up and get a far more holistic view? So if Bob does, or Steve does show back up on the website kind of after he's been engaging with email nurture, how do you change that? An awful lot of the CMS vendors, they don't have that visibility into something, right? They might just know what's happened on the CMS, and the map might know what's happened as a result of demand gen, etc. You need to really join that up. And again, that's a way to, again, kind of build the data set as rapidly as possible.
And if they choose not to accept cookies, does a recommender engine fall apart? Does it just default then to popularity and predefined paths?
Yeah, I mean, there's other ways of identification, obviously, beyond cookies. I mean, there's some interesting tech out there, which is doing things like looking at the browser stamp, as it were. But we currently don't use that. Yeah, it is cookie based in the same way. I think one of the things, I mean, obviously it's B2B marketing. Maybe we've been a bit lazy historically. We've cookied everyone, but we're in a post GDPR world these days. And I think one of the most important ways actually SAP is a customer of ours, and they have a far better talk on this than we do, because it's exactly how they use us. In a post-GDPR world, the most important thing is to build trust with an audience to be able to get permission basically to ask for that conversion, and you do that by showing them relevant content. So yes, if you can lean heavily on kind of what's popular, etc., with as much data as you can source beyond the truly personalized, so the fact they're coming from France, for example, or they're from this account, which we can do from an IP to account lookup. We don't need a cookie necessarily for that. And certainly something that I'm really interested in is how do we then marry intent data, third-party intent data, with what I like to think of as engaged intent, like first-party data, our data set. How do we marry these two? So again, if someone has been on, say, on G2 Crowd, researching something, we can take that as a feed coming in. How do we use that to be able to identify? That is cookie-based, but by this point, you're hopefully adding value. Yeah. And I don't think people have I think this is really important I don't think, Deloitte did a really interesting study on this here. When you add value, people are far more inclined to help you, right? Rather than simply kind of being no cookies, no, like utmost guarding their privacy. I think everyone realizes today that Amazon wouldn't work if they weren't cooking you, or if you weren't logging in, for example, and being able to see that. And so there is this kind of trade-off. You can build trust, you can show value, then you do get permission to do that.
And along those lines, so you were showing examples where there's videos and ebooks and blog posts, and we can mix in podcasts and webinars. Is there a ideal baseline amount of content that you think is needed for a recommender engine to work? Or if someone only has blog posts, is it worth their time to be thinking about how they could use AI rather than the human trying to map these paths?
That's a jolly good question. I think everyone's always got more content than they think they do, particularly in B2B, right? I mean, I ran a pop quiz recently internally, even across our own marketing team, to ask our folks, like, how many content assets do you think we have as PathFactory? We've got a relatively small marketing team. I mean, we're a 100-person company. So how many content assets do you think we have? And everyone came back and said, oh, I don't know, probably 100 max. And we actually have 350. Now, we produce a lot of content, but you inadvertently do. And one of the things that we do too is it's not all first-party content. So because we don't actually host content, we just serve it from wherever it lives. That allows you to actually radically expand your idea of what content is, right? Well, who are the third-party articles, experts in the space that you want people to be engaging with? If I look on any of our prospects or customers' kind of Twitter feeds, they're sharing third-party content all day long on Twitter and LinkedIn, and like, what they hope happens is that you magically go off and engage with this, and then you're going to come back to my property to find out, did I have a take on this? And of course, that doesn't happen. So how do we enable someone to actually grab the third-party content and combine that with your first-party content for a seamless kind of experience? So everyone's always got more content than they think they do. What they really mean is that they don't necessarily have enough as much content as they like, because people fall out of love with content really quickly. I do, written it, and then passed it on to the next thing. That doesn't mean that our audience has stopped loving it. Just because I wrote it 2 years ago, it doesn't mean it's still not relevant. There's always a long tail to content too. But yeah, if you've just got a blog, you can probably curate that yourself. But if you're dealing with volumes, if you've got multiple product lines, multiple services, multiple different parts of the business, if the buyer's journey is complicated, if content is a big part of that education, then you probably do need to start to think about how do you use AI to drive that better buyer experience.
Okay. The question just came in about the emailing the slides. Yes, we'll make the slides available, and we're also recording it, so we'll be able to make it on demand for people, and we'll share a link to that. Probably by the end of the week, we should have that ready to go. So I just have one or two more questions. The one that comes to mind immediately is, as we're talking about, like you just said, you had 300 assets and your team thought you had 100. I'm thinking of like the Institute. We've created over 500 articles in 3 years. And sometimes you forget the things you wrote, and really important pieces are buried from 3 years ago. So when you're moving to a recommender engine, does the software itself go back and look at everything and flag stuff that should be found within it? Or is there actually a manual process where the marketers themselves need to audit what you've got, look at your tagging system, look at the data? Like, so how much work, I guess, goes into onboarding a recommender engine is what I'm getting to.
Oh, that's a good question. I think the more work you do, probably the better, but you don't really have to. Although I strongly urge that should just be that should be good marketing practices, full stop, irrespective of AI or not. I mean, the better kind of the state that your content in, that's just going to have repercussions for everyone beyond simply using a recommender system. We don't rely on it when that's through necessity, because we see a variety of different states of content, as it were. So yeah, it's not I think one of the things there, and you and I have talked about this before, is I don't believe that B2B marketers are going to buy them some AI, right? And I think anyone that thinks like that is probably missing the boat to a degree. AI is just an enabling technology, and which problems can it help us solve? Hyper-personalization at scale, obvious one. Understanding the content and analyzing the relationship across 100 content assets of the relationship, another obvious application for it. But that's for solving problems, right? I don't think anyone in their right mind is probably going to go and just buy kind of AI off the shelf and start to plug it in. You've got to understand kind of like what problems are you trying to solve for, and therefore which vendors or which solutions do I want to look at, which are using AI in a smart way, and then first and foremost changing some of my metrics.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, and we have to talk about that. It's you either try and solve a specific problem you're having, or you look at a use case of I spend 100 hours a month doing this thing, and if I can do it more efficiently, great.
Yeah.
And that would probably be a good place to sort of wrap. Do you have any final thought on what would be your action step for someone who's listened in on this, doesn't have a recommender engine, but has a ton of assets on their site? What would you advise them to do as sort of a next step in the process?
Beyond pick up the phone and give us a shout.
Yeah,
that's a good question, Paul. I think first and foremost, I think one of the things I've seen some of our customers do really well is to look at the number of touch points that their buyers are having to go through. So go and look at like last quarter's kind of close one business and see if you can backwards engineer the number of touches that you guys had to do, and then look at the volume of content. And even if you don't have our analytics, you can probably still do that off the map and stuff. I saw one of our customers recently did this, but actually they've been a customer for a while. They created a benchmark across something. They saw that they were having like 14 interactions per individual in a buying committee to get them to kind of close one. And so that really that created an opportunity for us and for them. It's like, right, how do we remove steps in this? How do we enable the buyers to accelerate through it? And that really started to come up with some really interesting ideas as to how we could then solve for that on the website, in email nurture, etc. It's like, right, if that's our baseline, how do we remove friction from that and do a better job of enabling our buyers?
Yeah, and I think the other thing I would add is just go look at the workflows you have. I mean, I know as an agency, we did this last year, and we were trying to predict those buyer paths. And so you create this 3-part drip campaign, and we had ebooks that were getting dripped that were like 5 years old. And you realize like, wow, not only do we not, like, these are so not optimized. It's like the opposite of what we're trying to do. And so I think any tools you can use that keep the workflows fresh and actually do personalize them is going to be a huge value to people.
Yeah, and involve the buyer in that, right? Like, why we don't have to do all the work. I think that's probably the takeaway. It's like our generation, the generation below us, even more kind of digitally savvy, digitally native, they're going to do the work. We see this all day long. So just give them the keys to your content. So
if you want to flip to we got there's 2 quick housekeeping slides to end it up. We do have the Marketing AI Conference. As I mentioned, PathFactory was a platinum sponsor in 2019, and I'm sure they'll be back in 2020. I should put Nick on the spot right now. I'm kidding. So that's 2020. You can go to macon.ai and learn more about that. We're looking at about 500 attendees this year, probably about 70 speakers. So that should be great. And then one more slide, Nick. we have a webinar coming up next month on piloting AI. So that'll be a free webinar like this one that we'll be running. We'll be sending out more information about that in the coming week. And I'd just again like to thank Nick for joining us and PathFactory for their support and everybody who took the time to be with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks, everyone.
All
Cheers.
right. Thanks again.
Thanks, Paul. Bye.